I have made a habit of experimenting with new ways to destroy my career. And I mean, that's a long-standing, it's a habit of the heart, right, for me. I, many years ago, started a blog with one of my very close friends and a very dear colleague, former colleague, named Eric Rauschway. And we spent 3, 4, even 5 years feeding this blog on a daily basis and thinking about what writing in that way and in that medium could mean for us as historians. And while I was doing that work, I became fascinated with the way that scholars interact with publics, plural. And I ultimately became very frustrated and dissatisfied with blogging. I felt like the community was smaller than it promised to be, and I also found it exhausting, having to produce material on a daily basis. And then finally, I ended up feeling like I had literally said everything that I had to say ever. That I was simply repeating myself every time I posted, and that became paralyzing. While I was writing for the blog, though, I was writing a series of drafts of the Sand Creek book. I am about to tell a kind of how not to story. This is a primer on how not to write a book. I initially wrote what I thought was a relatively traditional scholarly monograph in which approximately half of the book was devoted to the history of the Sand Creek Massacre, and then the second half of the book was devoted to the story of memorializing that event. Around that time, a couple of things happened that prompted me to rethink the narrative conventions that I was working with. First of all, I had colleagues who were doing really extraordinary work, Louis Warren, Kathy Olmsted, Alan Taylor, all of whom were producing work that was beautifully written and of the highest scholarly quality, and I just didn't feel like what I was writing measured up. And so my imposter syndrome motivated me to begin to rethink the project. And then at the same time, I was reading about the neuroscience of memory. And I became fascinated with the way in which memory doesn't function particularly well. That the way, and I'm not a neuroscientist, and I don't feel totally comfortable holding forth on these issues, but as I understood it at the time, our minds function in such a way that they create narrative out of fractured memories. And that for that reason, our memories are often extraordinarily unreliable because they have been ordered by our mind so that we can make sense of them, but they're not necessarily an accurate reflection of what happened in a given moment. And so I wrote a draft of the Sand Creek book that included a great deal of material about the neuroscience of memory, and it was awful. I'm bad at writing about science, and I didn't know what I was talking about. And so I stripped all of that out for a third draft of the book. This is a complete overhaul of the book. But that third draft of the book was the one in which I adopted the sort of narrative framing that I use in what was ultimately published, and that was a series of flashbacks. Was rather than having one section on the massacre and then another section on memorializing it, I wanted to write about the modern story of memorializing the massacre and then have episodes from the past that would inject themselves into that process, to some extent that would haunt that process. And so I did, and it was okay, and I kept that, but I ended up writing 2 more drafts of the book after that, and I could explain why, but it gets pretty deep in the weeds. But that's how I ended up with that. And in the meantime, I was asked by an editor if I would write a very, very short, very accessible history of the Civil War for a popular audience. And I passed. I passed because of the word count. It was too few words. I couldn't figure out a way to write this book that she wanted me to write. And then I was very frustrated with myself for having passed on that opportunity because I thought of myself as a Civil War historian. I was writing about the Civil War when I was writing about Sand Creek, but nobody else thought of me as a Civil War historian. Everyone thought of me as the author of this, well, insofar as anyone thought of me at all, which wasn't much. But when people thought of me, they thought of me as the author of this environmental history of New Orleans. And so I had passed on this opportunity. And so I became obsessed with the question of how many words would one actually need to tell the story of the Civil War. And I decided that and I began to conceptualize this as a problem or as a puzzle. And the solution that I came up with was a graphic history. And so I pitched this idea to an editor at Farrar, Straus and Giroux at Hill and Wang, who was doing some graphic histories at that time. And he thought it was a good idea because he thought he could sell them. And he put me in touch with the person who eventually became my co-author, Jonathan Federvorm, who had written his own graphic history of the atomic bomb, a wonderful book called Trinity. And Jonathan and I began to work on this. And so the truest answer to how I thought about this kind of an unconventional narrative is that I thought about it as an opportunity, but then I didn't think about it particularly in any sort of sophisticated way. I didn't actually know what I was getting myself into. And Jonathan, this illustrator, actually had to spend a couple of years teaching me how to do this. And so I got myself in way over my head, as I often do.